Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Everything Kosher. Today, we have a really, really special guest. I will let her introduce herself way more in depth because everywhere I researched her, there were about a billion adjectives that came up to describe what she does, who she is. But she's an author, she's worked on films, she's done production, and is just really wearing a lot of hats and is really good at all of them. So Priyanka, could you just give us as in-depth of an introduction that you would like about yourself, what you do, and about all of the different things that you've kind of become experienced with over the years?
Yes, of course. I understand that it is confusing. People don't really know what to call me. I'm definitely currently an author. I just wrote a memoir, Bird Milk and Mosquito Bones, about growing up Kashmiri, but also, all over the place, as a lot of us have. But I originally, started out as a pre-med student at the University of Michigan, turned my back on that. I went to law school. I worked at an agency in Los Angeles, like a Hollywood agency. So I was a talent agent for a while after that. I had a production company with Jack Black. I developed a lot of TV and films with him. And then I left to write after the birth of my first baby. I sold some TV ideas. I started screenwriting, and then I sold this book idea, which is a memoir and essays about growing up Kashmiri. To Knopf during the pandemic, and that just came out in June. I sold them a second book, which I'm writing right now. I'm working on some TV stuff. So yeah, I have my fingers. I would say like I'm a filmmaker and an author, and that's what I end up spending most of my time on. But I have done a lot of things. I love to try a job. It's true.
This is Season 2, Episode 8, Pieces of Life in Kashmir, a conversation with memoirist Priyanka Mattoo.
Yeah, and I was reading about, all the things, and they're not huge shifts in like the later parts of your career, but I'm curious as to how did still the medical school to law school jump. Okay, still in the same vein,
Mm-hmm.
but to go from law school into you said an
Mm-hmm.
agency that is two different like lanes on the freeway. So I'm curious how that change was or what inspired you to make that pivot.
I knew pretty early on that I didn't want to practice law. I found it really boring. I just thought it was really boring. I was like, this is a lot of paperwork, and I'm not interested in the day-to-day of the job. However, big picture, I like the idea of maybe like negotiating a little. Like it wasn't that much of a shift because a lot of lawyers become agents, like, or a lot of agents used to be lawyers. So I knew a friend was moving to LA. I thought it might be interesting to try my hand at entertainment. And one of the co-founders of the company, United Talent Agency, was a lawyer who had gone to Michigan. So I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, I'm interested in finding out what all this is about. Um, could I come interview?" He interviewed me, he hired me, and I started in the mailroom at United Talent Agency right after I graduated law school. I was 23 years old, 24 years old. And from there, I was an assistant to a talent agent who represented actors, like movie stars, comedians. And then I was promoted to be an agent on their team. And then eventually I started signing my own people. So yeah, it seems like a big shift, but many of my colleagues had legal training.
So I know you just described kind of like a gradual process to get to kind of that agent
Hmm.
acting role through like these various like smaller roles that you built up and
Hmm.
gained experience through. I'm
Hmm.
curious now shifting like a little bit over to your memoir, if
Hmm.
starting to write that, I know you said it was during the pandemic, was kind of a similar process, or how really it is to enter into like the publication world. Because I know you did say that
Hmm.
you came off of like screenwriting and selling those
Hmm.
rights to those plays, the scripts for it.
Hmm.
Um, and so do you think that helped you, or do you think it's like a completely different ball game from your agency work?
No, it definitely helped me just knowing the well, the publishing, no. I mean, the screenwriting, what being in entertainment taught me was that was to take risks, and not big risks. These are all just, if it looks when you look at my resume, it looks like I've done a lot of big, disparate, crazy things, but really it was always a little sidestep into something that felt like slightly less unfamiliar. So in my view, I'm just going into deeper and deeper water, like unfamiliar waters, but I'm still taking a rational path. So after I'd worked in screenwriting for a little bit, once the pandemic happened and everything sort of shut down in entertainment as they figured out what was going on, I have always loved reading. I mean, I'm a book person more than I'm a TV person, more than I'm a film person. I read avidly and I love books. I love memoirs. I love personal essay. I've always loved it. I wrote a little bit in college, a little bit, here and there, but I never thought of it as a career. But I started writing a couple of essays and publishing them during the pandemic because that's really what I had time for. I was home with two kids and my husband, and we were just kind of being stretched thin. And I could write, these essays that you publish in the Times or whatever are like 1,200 words, 1,500 words. And that I could do. So I remember writing an essay about Raksha Bandhan for the Times. And then after that, I wrote the first thing about Kashmir. I had read something about just like a news story about what was going on. And I was just so fed up. I mean, not fed up because obviously these things have to be reported, but I was like, the vast majority of coverage out there about the Kashmir community, whether it's Hindu or Muslim, is about things that have happened to us. And I've never seen a celebration, I don't think I have, of like who we are as a people, as a living people, not as like a glass box in history, and not as like a tragic timeline of horrors, which I think is the context often. And I think we're pretty great. I think we're really cool. I think we're really smart and interesting and funny and tight knit and fiercely loyal and all these things. And we all and outside of the sort of like religious conflict talk, I was like, all of us, no matter what your background, have lost the same thing, right? So can we celebrate the thing that we lost? And can we celebrate how much we have in common for having lost that thing? So I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. I wrote it as just like, I wrote an essay. I was compelled to write this essay about my summers in Kashmir growing up. I sent it into the New York Times as cold. I just sent it to the editorial. I don't even know. I just sent it to people I knew were editors at the Times. And I sort of immediately got a phone call back from this wonderful man named Bashar Atbir, also Kashmiri Muslim, lovely guy, was the international opinion editor. And he was like in tears. And it was so beautiful. It was just so beautiful to make that connection with him, because he had also grown up there. He's, his family's still there. And I know my family was scared because they were like, well, what if, how we are, we can be nervous. And my parents were like, please don't write about Kashmir. You're going to put a target on your back. And I was like, I promise you, I'm going to walk this tightrope just right, because it's so much it's not about politics. It's about something personal. And so that was the piece that then I think became the cornerstone of the book. And that got a really nice response. And it got exactly what I was hoping, which was a lovely response from Indians, Pakistanis, Kashmiris of all backgrounds. Like it just was, I wanted to unite rather than divide, which was a lot of the energy that I felt like we were getting in Kashmiri coverage.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it was a couple years back that I was talking to some friends and talking about how when we think of like stories of Kashmir, it's so much just focused on like violence and focused on just things that have happened that, shouldn't have happened to anybody, but we fail to celebrate like the culture in some ways. And our culture is really, really different, I think, like it is in any part of India. I think you go anywhere and it's really different because we're just such a mix of people and cultures. But there's a lot of things that set us apart, certain festivals. And I think it's really, really cool to have someone who is kind of pushing that narrative, because we don't really see a lot of it. And I think we still don't see a lot of it, even though, like, even though we all say the same things, like say that, yeah, like I wish there was more about this. I wish there was more about that. There's still not that much being put out.
Yeah.
So I think it was really, really cool that you've written this memoir, Bird Milk and Mosquito Bones. And I was reading an interview that you did. I don't remember who the interviewing party was, but you mentioned that you had, lived there fully when you were like a toddler and then visited a lot of Kashmir until you were like 9, 10-ish, prior to moving out. I'm really curious as to what you would say and it might be hard to pick out one, your favorite memory that took place during that time or something that you kind of brought into the memoir with you.
I feel so sad for you guys because I mean you have wonderful lives in many ways, but it's so hard for me to know that you guys will never have never ex I'm the oldest of my cousins and I'm the last one who remembers it. And that is really hard for me because in some ways I share much more with the generation older than me than my own generation in our family. And so like I will retell stories of like who our parents were, who our grandparents were, who, so I'm like the keeper of all the stories now. Um, I'm on a WhatsApp with like all of them, constantly being like, actually, like I'll retell a story, I'll leave a voice note, I'll fill them in, but I've written it all down in the book. Yeah, the clearest, I was very happy and relaxed in Kashmir for sure. But the clearest memory is just a sensory memory of being in Kashmir, whether it was Srinagar or Pahalgam, and just feeling like remembering what the air felt like and remembering what the water tasted like. Those are two I didn't mean them to be strong themes in the book, but remembering the mountain air and the mountain water I mean, it's so much. It's like a fish returning to its river. Like it's just so much who we are. Um, and it's so interesting to me because I feel like over time I have learned, obviously, like I can go back and see it. It's not going to be exactly what it was to me. It is still stunningly beautiful from, like from all accounts. And I would love to see it, but you can't recapture what it was in 1988 without much automation, with still tongas, going across the bridges. It was very, very analog. It was an analog place by like pride and design. It wasn't because we didn't have the technology. Everyone was a PhD in electrical engineering. It was because we liked living that way. And still, I mean, I think central heating is just showing up in Kashmir because they're like, who needs it? And that to me is also like something lovely. But the thing that I've learned as I'm in my mid 40s now is that I can capture so many of those feelings just by, this is maybe not a thing that we often do, but just getting into nature. I know that sounds so dumb, but like really exploring, like camping or just like being in places I am so happy near a lake. I am so happy in a mountain. I am so happy, in these places that remind me in a sensory way of like what birthed me. And I think I just wasn't just in the intellectual space that we're in, the cerebral space that we're in, the workspace, the cities. Like it's just something that I never really, I thought, well, that's not really our thing, but I'm like, it's absolutely our thing. Being out in nature is 100% our thing. We avoided technology for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years so that the air could be fresh, so that the water could be clean, like this is who we are. We got to get out there. We got to get to a lake. We got to get to a mountain. We got to get camping, even though it sounds crazy. It took a second for me to get there. And now we do these trips where we're like in the US, especially where you get to explore any kind of terrain that reminds me of home.
Yeah, definitely. I totally understand where you're coming from about like that sensory memory. And I do think in some ways, there are like certain things, or like I think the word is like something that you're yearning for, that even like our younger generation who hasn't
Mm-hmm.
been in Kashmir, that can feel that's like passed down
Mm-hmm.
generationally, just because it's in our bodies and in our culture, and it's like a
Interesting.
living, breathing thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
I tell my mom all the time, like I really wish I
Mm-hmm.
was on a mountain and it was raining and like there's like trees, and I just love the environment. Like we go, like I've been to Tahoe so
Yeah.
many times,
Yeah.
and Tahoe is just one of like the perfect emulations of that. Like there's mountains and lakes and
Yeah.
trees and everything. And I think like sometimes we hold on to like those yearnings and they're passed down generationally. It's not just trauma that gets passed down, I think. I think it's some of these like
Yes.
living,
The
feeling, like
joy.
breathing things.
The
Yeah.
joy. And we need to, yeah, we talk about the trauma all the time, but what about the things we're drawn to without any explanation? I live a mile from the beach in
Yeah, I was
LA.
gonna say I see trees behind you.
Yeah, I don't like salt water. I just don't like it. I find it annoying. I think it's gross. I don't like it touching my clothes, and I'm like, why am I so allergic to salt water? I'm like, oh, because I want a lake. I want like a lake. I want a rapids. I want a lazy river. I want like what I think is water.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you're down near LA, so that's a little bit tricky, but I think once you get to
Yeah.
LA, you can find it.
Totally. Well, my
Um,
parents are in Michigan, so we just spent
okay.
a bunch of time up north on those beautiful, beautiful lakes. I mean, it's just stunning, and I'm so happy there. And my nervous system totally resets, and my kids love it. And my husband, who's a New Yorker, is like, "What is this magical place?"
Very,
Um,
very different.
yeah. So we will continue to go back to that because it hits scratches something for sure. So we can long for home, but we can still scratch the itch.
Yeah. And in the same interview that I read, you'd also talked about your influences like familially. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, you moved around a lot, so your parents were part of that influence. But you
Mm-hmm.
also talked about your Nanu, who was really important in kind of shaping the direction you took. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about him from you and kind of
Yeah.
how he has impacted your life into, who you are today and all the things you do.
Yeah, my Nanaji was a very larger than life figure. He was a physics professor at the engineering university. So anyone who went through engineering school in Kashmir, which is thousands of people who we all know, remembers Professor Somnath Kaul. Uh, he was just he had his bellowing voice and a mustache that he like twirled and like this huge amazing head of hair, and he just perfect posture, and he just was a real character. Now he might have been scary to a lot of people, and I understand why he would have been scary to a lot of people, but he loved girls. It was mostly girls in the family. And he loved me. I was his first grandchild. And so while he was this sort of like, thunderclap of a human, he also was very like, I would never say soft and squishy with me, but he approved. He was like very loving and very supportive, and he enjoyed spending time with me in a way that I don't know a lot of men at the time would have with a strange little girl, and his own daughter. So we were lucky to have that time together, and I was lucky to get a real sense of who he was and sort of his sense of the pillars of one's character, right? It was always better to tell the truth than to lie. It was never worth lying, like who are you if you lie? It was better to be yourself than to put on any sort of pretense because, then better to be a little strange, if you have to be, because then at least you're being your true self. It was crucial to attend to your studies. It was the most important thing because this was a generation also that had so much taken away from them between partition and sort of the ups and downs and various, family difficulties. Like it was like the one thing that no one could take away from you was like the investment that you put into your brain was crucial. And that was all about, everyone in the family was educated. The women were highly educated. Like that was a crucial investment in the family. And so those things stayed with me. I mean, that's absolutely, I think he shaped the entire family. I think he shaped me. I think he shaped anyone he came into contact with. He was a real force. And I look at our large family, which is like, between my mom and my masis and my mamus, these are all, my Nanaji and his brother, and he was the oldest, and his brother and sister, they all built a house together. So they had a joint family household with separate quarters. And there were, was it 11 kids or 12 kids, of which my mother was the oldest. And so I say that like, everyone thundered through the house. It was like everyone had sprouted from the head of Zeus. You know what I mean? Like, and everyone sort of was raised in that soup. And all the women in my family are, people are always asking me where I get my confidence from. And I'm like, I don't know any other way to be. Every woman I know, every woman I was raised by. And remember, I was the first grandchild. So I was just handed around among like 12 women because I was the baby doll. And so that's what I took in was like these amazing, like loud voice, hyper intelligent, loud laughing, big personality women. That's all I've ever seen. I don't think I saw a sweet, shy lady in my whole life. I was lucky.
Yeah, I definitely see some of those same things within like my own family. Like my
Mm.
also Nana G, my mom is one of three sisters.
Mm.
And every time he was very much, and to this day, he'll still say it to them, but
Hmm.
he very much was like, you have to have degrees, you have to go forward. And at one point, like just logistical reasons, my mom didn't end up doing her PhD. And to this
Hmm.
day, he'll still be like, you should still go back, still
Yeah.
get one, like you
Yeah.
can still do it. And it's not even in a disparaging or like a discouraging way,
No.
rather the opposite. Rather, he's like, of course you can still do it, you
Yeah.
should. And like I'm also the first grandchild on my mom's side, so
Hmm.
I've had like similar experiences where they all joke that like in a past life that he was like my mom because
Mm.
I and you know what, maybe I've gotten away with things, but according to him I can't do anything wrong. But he's so supportive, and so I think that kind of thing is just transient through like all Kashmiri families. You mentioned
Yeah.
earlier about how you wanted to describe the kind of close-knit and loyalty of the
Hmm.
community. Um and I'm curious, as you've traveled through India, then I think you were in London, Saudi Arabia,
Hmm.
then New York, Michigan, California. I don't know if I got the
Hmm.
order right, but
Yeah.
touchdown in these places. How you found the sense of community within Kashmiris in those places? Because I know in the US we have like New York has a pretty big
Yeah.
community. I know a bunch of like at least youth my age that are out there.
Hmm.
And I know here out in the Bay Area, we've got a pretty strong
Yeah.
community. But I'm curious as to how you found those communities varied or even in ways they were similar across those places.
Yeah, we were in New York very briefly. So I do know some of the community there for sure, and we had some really good friends out there, but I would call my home community, my home community is the Michigan Kashmiri community, which is huge. It's so big. I mean, it's like 70, 80 families, something like that, more than you would expect for like suburban Detroit. But those people have been so incredible for my, it's funny to say upbringing because I didn't move to Michigan until I was 17. But the thing that they offered, not only are they just the most wonderful, like, I mean, Kashmir meets Midwest, like it's the best, the best people, the best, most grounded, straightforward, funny, awesome people. No one's trying to be fancy. No one's like, there's no competition of any kind. Everyone's just awesome and living outside of Detroit. Um, so they're like for sure my people, but also the amazing thing that happened when we got to Michigan was that my mother met or reconnected with her best friend from when she was 5. And that was just such a love fest. And she's, when they picked up right where they left off, and my parents have really found such a strong, strong foundation in Michigan. So even though it's kind of like retroactive, like they lost what they lost, they still have a giant portion of the community that they grew up with, like right there. And that has been so uh just formative and encouraging for me because they're my aunties and uncles. They're like I refer to them as my cousins if anyone asks about these people. We are also all on a text chain together, me and all the Michigan kids. We're not kids, I'm middle-aged, but but yeah, we always everyone sends out stuff about my book or like someone else's event or like an achievement here or like a photo there at someone's wedding and it's a really nice, it's a wonderful group and I'm really lucky to be a part of it.
Yeah, and I think that how you talked about you moved in there when you were 17, but
Mm,
you were kind of like absorbed in by the community, I think is
yeah.
really representative of Kashmiris everywhere. I think
Hmm.
if you're walking down the street, like I'll actually give an example. I was coming back from India earlier this year and I was just sitting on the plane and it's like grandparent season in like
Hmm.
May time. So like all the grandparents are coming to the US because the summers are getting like hotter in India and the
Hmm.
kids, don't have school here. So our plane was mostly full of like nanus, nannies, dadas, dadis, like all
Hmm.
the older folks. And I was sitting there and I was maybe like one of few like non-elder people. And
Hmm.
I'm halfway through the plane ride and I'm hearing somebody speak Kashmir. I'm like, where am I hearing this from? Who is this? And it's very like you can tell
Yeah.
very quickly,
Yeah.
not just the language, but the tonally, how we
Yeah.
speak and
Yeah.
like the accent. Like one of my favorite,
Yeah.
getting back to Jammu is like my favorite thing. I always tell my mom is I love the way people sound here. And like
Mm.
when you land in Jammu, you know you're in Jammu
Hmm.
immediately. And so similarly, I somehow later in the thing, I was like, walked up and I was like, oh, I really like your Dejor. And I just started talking about her Dejor because my
Hmm.
mom has she has like a kasu on the bottom of her Dejor, so it's not like a traditional
Okay.
shape. So I was like talking to her about it, and she's like, oh, and like immediately there was no like pretense of the fact that like I didn't know this person at all.
No.
But it was just so quickly on how they want to connect because I think there's this like immediate idea or like a familiarity, even if you don't know
Mm.
somebody
Oh yeah.
immediately. And I think that that's such a strong thing that whenever we see anybody from our community, we just take them in.
Yeah.
And they kind of become like a part and parcel of who we are.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the other side of having, lost is that we hold on so tightly. Literally, like
Yeah.
I'll be on a plane and I'll hear someone speaking Kashmiri and I'll turn around and then they're grabbing my arms. Like we don't just go like, "Oh," politely like from a distance.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah. It's a very,
it's
I
like
think,
a
a physical
physical.
relation.
Yeah. 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 And my arm is being squeezed. I'm being asked to dinner. I'm being grilled about my whole family. And
Yeah,
it's comforting. It would be really startling to anyone else.
it is. And it's also immediately, okay, is there, and because a lot of us are related, if you go back a couple
Hmm.
generations, because we were so dwindled down to just like a few families, it's
Hmm.
always so interesting because it always comes up anybody and somebody trying to find some sort of relation to potentially be like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Or even
The
if it's not like a
connection.
blood relation,
Hmm.
like it's a friendship, it's like a neighborly
Hmm.
relation. There's so many times I've been like, oh, yeah, these people were our neighbors next to them, and that's how we know them.
Yeah.
And I've heard from people, and it's just about kind of placing people back together, I think, in Kashmir so
Hmm.
much. Because, and you mentioned it earlier, is you can go back, but it's not entirely the same
No.
environment and you can't replicate that. But I think it's really, really cool that, people here are continuing to kind of hold down the fort
Hmm.
in some ways. But you more talking about your memoir, um, I think you wanted to, like you said, achieve like this cultural celebration of Kashmiri culture and the joys and the positivities. I'm
Hmm.
curious as to which Kashmiri festivals kind of make your, I don't want to say like your favorites list, but what are kind of the things that you hold closest to you, um, and that you continue practicing? Like now you're in LA with your kids
Hmm.
and how you're kind of fostering that culture for your kids.
It sort of depends actually, because I'm not a hyper religious person. I try to like sort of preserve the culture in many ways. So it's more subtle than that. I mean, of course when my parents will celebrate Shivratri, never whatever, like when we're home, it's a whole we participate and that's really fun. We don't have a full apparatus for festivals here, although I'm sure if I tapped into like Orange County, I could attend something. But the Kashmiri, especially with a blended family or like a multiracial family, because my husband's Jewish, um, we eat a lot of Kashmiri food. We're not like, oh my God, and this is Kashmiri, eat this. Like we eat a lot of Kashmiri foods. They're with my parents a lot. Like my parents come here a lot. We're home for large stretches of time. They're with my parents for large stretches of the summer, just like I was with my grandparents for large stretches of the summer. And we're sort of doing that on purpose because I never want the culture to feel like a burden, which sometimes it did for me, I'll be honest. It felt like, oh my God, can we ever get away from talking about this? Because it was so fraught and everyone was so raw and so upset and angry and constantly yelling about politics for like most of my childhood because it was so fresh, like everything that happened in 89. I was 9, 10. So like my entire tweendom, teenage years, early 20s were just people screaming about politics. And I was like, I need to get away from sort of, this sort of morass of culture and just like dig into the things I really love, which is like family closeness, staying in touch with our Kashmiri family and friends, making sure that we are constantly in touch with our cuisine. And then, I mean, it's really funny because as like an Indian American, there are so many festivals that are celebrated where you're like, I don't know, we weren't big on that, but then we've kind of like accepted it as like, all right, well, that's something. Um, but within our own family culture, hilariously, like the biggest deal for us, which is not necessarily a big deal for Kashmiris, was Raksha Bandhan. Raksha Bandhan was a very, very big deal in my house. It was huge. My brother and I are super close. My parents probably brainwashed us to be super close. And I do the same with my kids. Like I just put it in the calendar for Monday, and we're gonna have a special dinner. They're gonna pick up. We don't do the one-way Rakhi gift thing because we've made up our own, which is they each pick out a small gift for each other, and then he will get a Rakhi, although she's 5 and she might be mad that he gets a decoration and she doesn't. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. My brother and I lived in the same city forever, 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 and now he lives in London, which is very hard. Great for him, sad for me. And so I will send him a Rakhi and be calling him. But that to me, not only as as like a festival, as like a Hindu Indian festival, the underlying meaning is so important to me. That brother-sister bond, which was always really, really special to me and my brother, I hope to pass down to my kids.
So you earlier also mentioned that you've done a lot of production
Mm.
and your films have been highlighted at a variety of, festivals, like
Mm-hmm.
film festivals
Mm-hmm.
specifically. And so I'm curious about if you have any interests or passions in pursuing any form of memoir through film, or if you think you're going to kind of continue with the written word.
Oh, yeah, I'm always working on film and TV stuff. That's just quieter. It doesn't, it's like always in development. It takes longer. So yeah, I made a short film. The first thing ever wrote and directed was a short film, about my family, and that I'm writing I finished the script before I handed in the book, and then the book has just taken over. So I need to go back and do a rewrite. That was before the Writers Guild strike. So I need to go back and do the rewrite so that I can start getting that movie going. But that's a family story. It's like inspired by my parents. So yeah, I think the autobiographical stuff always makes its way into my work. There's like a detective show that I've sold to CBS that's about a lady detective, like Indian lady detective with oldest daughter, who's
Yeah.
like really close with her parents, but needs to sort of carve out her own path. And that is a theme that I return to over and over again. But I'm sure there will be like 10 different things from my book that turn into various TV shows and movies because everything I've ever experienced is in there. So I think I'll just keep dipping back into it.
Yeah, speaking of your mom, I think you did I don't know if it was like a Zoom interview or it was like some sort of article that you worked on during the pandemic about getting recipes from a mother. And
Yeah. Mhm.
I would just love to hear so from what I can take in, you and your mom are very close. And you
Mhm.
mentioned food earlier as well. And I think that's a huge important part of my life as well. How do you think that kind of has shaped your relationship with food or slash your mom as well? Because I think those like the kitchen really brings women, especially Kashmiri women, and even like men
Yeah.
together. Because I think everybody in our family holds expertise in like different areas of
Yeah.
food.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, I wrote a piece for the New Yorker about wrangling my mother's Rogan Josh recipe from her. Not that she had a recipe, you know how they cook. And I'm the same way. I like look at something and I make it, so I get it. I get that she was like, I can't give you quantities. It's a lot of work. And I was like, well, we were separated by the pandemic and I wanted Rogan Josh, and the only way to do it was to call her and help her, ask her to walk me through it. So that's what we did, and she gave me a recipe which is like pretty reliable. There's like one slight change I would make, but it's too late for that. Less water, I think. But anyway, um, the point is that me actually learning how to make her food, I've always cooked. I've always been self-sufficient on the food front, but I've always allowed her to make the Kashmiri food. because we all play our roles in the family, right? And mom makes the Kashmiri food and I eat the Kashmiri food. And if anyone feels like a delicious salad or some salmon or whatever, that's my job, as like a Western daughter, Western influenced daughter. I pop in and I make something that isn't a 8 course Kashmiri
Yeah.
meal. Right. So any meal, like I said, like my dad will look up and be like, I want a sandwich. And I like, that's my job. Right. Like, well, I'll make you a sandwich. Um, but it's been interesting. This is probably like deeper than you need me to go. But it's been interesting because now that I know how to make the food, right? Which I do. There's also a really good cookbook by Sarla Razdan, which I find so unlike most Kashmiri cookbooks, which are just like so opaque and bizarre and weirdly worded. I think because too many of us are like scientists. And so I'm like, no, no, no. Let's just like write a cookbook that we can actually understand and use. And like Sarla Razdan has written, I think, the best. Like just if you want to cook anything, it's in there. It's very simple. I found it in my early 30s and I still use it. But now that I can do it, my mother, there is a little bit of like, well, what's my job? And I'm like, oh, you can just hang out. Like we could just like the definition of because so much of how we show love for each other is in doing things for each other, and we're so like firmly defined by the things that we do for each other and the roles that we play. Once I take that role away, what does it mean for us? And that has been puzzling to her. And I'm like, you can literally just hang out. And she like cannot. I'm like, okay, organize the pantry. Like you can't stop moving. You can't just like sit there and hang out. So what can we find you to do? Because I've got dinner covered. Do you know what I mean? Um, and so, yeah, I'm thinking constantly, especially with our mothers who have worked really long, hard lives in many ways as caretakers and at their jobs. I hope that I can hold my mother's hand in guiding her past utility, just like being useful is fine and great, but it's a lot of, especially for women of a certain age and above, I think being useful was the only thing they got praised for. And so I want to I'm exploring this in my second book is like, what if you just are a person? What if you just relax? Who are you as a person when you're not doing something for other people? It's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard. There's going to be a lot of fights, but luckily I love a difficult conversation, so we'll get there.
Yeah, I think so much of our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation, especially that went through 89, were
Yeah.
focused on doing and doing
Mm-hmm.
as much as they could to kind of survive
Mm-hmm.
and to kind of avoid
Mm-hmm.
what happened. And I think that's like continued that it's so hard. Like my grandparents, it's so hard to get them to relax.
Yep.
Like my grandmother, she will be like, let us please like
Mm-hmm.
get you other like automated kind of gadgets
Mm-hmm.
for the kitchen,
Mm-hmm.
or be like, let's
Mm-hmm.
get you somebody that can come in and help you
Mm-hmm.
cook, not even like
Mm-hmm.
trying to take
Mm-hmm.
everything away from her. And it's just such she doesn't she wants to sit there and peel tomatoes, but not with a peeler, with a knife, because
Yeah.
that's what she's done her whole life.
Yeah.
But it's horrible for her fingers, it's horrible for her health,
Yeah.
but she doesn't know any other way. um and I
Yeah.
think that, but honestly, I do think that that kind of like stubbornness is still characteristic like in us as
Oh,
well
it's
in
very,
different ways.
you
And I
should
think,
be able to be self-sufficient. You should be able to do everything yourself.
yeah,
And there are many rude awakenings along the way. For example, if you are a working person who then has children, you can't do everything yourself
yeah.
because then you have a job and then you have a child, and those are two jobs.
Yeah, and we've kind of like you mentioned that your grandfather and his siblings, they were in like a communal home,
Hmm.
and so it was a completely different ball game. But that ball
Exactly.
game doesn't exist
No,
anymore.
they had the village, which they acknowledged. My mother was like, the second my kids were born, she was like, you got to hire some help because I was like, what did you do? She was like, I handed you to my mother. Like,
Yeah.
like it was totally different for her. And I'm glad she has supported me in that way because I think a lot of people have kids and their moms are like, I did it all. You should do it all. And my mom never, never, never thought that.
Yeah, and I think the kind of the final thing that I wanted to touch upon now, you are, you're doing some production stuff, but you're also doing some podcast production and you have like a fleet of productions. I don't know if that's still an ongoing
Mm-hmm.
project, but I definitely saw that whilst I was researching you.
Yeah, no, we had a great, I loved our company, Erios, where we made I think some really like elevated, awesome shows for women, for everybody, hosted by women. And we had a slate of 13, oh God, like 22 shows. We had like a Margaret Cho show, we had a Feist show, we had a Black and Brown Beauty and Wellness show that I hosted with my friend Camilla Blackett. We had some really, really incredible shows. And then, the market kind of changed and Spotify's changed things and the market has become, okay, well, how can you break through with millions of listeners? And it's like, well, either you have to be famous or you have to sort of appeal to a lowest common denominator, you know. Um, and I don't think the market supports the kind of shows that we wanted to make. So what started to happen was that the ad sales did not keep up with the production costs. And so after 5 years of operation, our choice was like, okay, do we try to look for more money to bring in to invest? And the choice then was like, no, I don't think so, because then we have to change. It was like a pure artistic expression of what we wanted to make. And the second we opened that up to other people's opinions about what should be taken to market, it was just not going to be the same exercise. So we just sort of like group hugged and we're like, we did it, we did it. It was great. And now we're done.
So that's such an interesting experience because even when talking to other people in the industry, I think sometimes it's not really highlighted how much that sometimes projects just kind of not end negatively, but kind of just come to a standstill.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you would say would be like one thing that you learned that you would like to give to advice to like our listeners who are kind of,
Hmm.
all on within like, KOA youth, we're all on under 30 here.
Hmm.
But in case there are listeners above the age of 30, it still applies in like career or in other like projects. If they experience something like that, or, in any shape or form of ventures ending and ventures beginning.
Yeah, I think that I think in everything, I've done so many things. I think the through line has always been for me to follow my own curiosity and what moves me and have some faith in that. That if I'm interested and if I like it and I can get excited about it, then other people can as well. As opposed to waking up and thinking, what does the market want? Because the market shifts so often, especially when you're talking about in media or in film. It's like, okay, now everyone wants this kind of comedy. Okay, now you can't run around trying to make a bunch of suits happy. For creative projects, especially, I think I have to wake up every morning and be like, okay, well, what am I interested in? What can't I stop thinking about? I never think about what does the market want. I never, ever have. I never will, because I know, having been sort of on the business side of it, I know how shifty and vague and grasping at straws it all is. Because when something amazing comes out of the woodwork, it's not because an exec wanted it. It's because like a creative person had an idea that they could not stop thinking about and they made it happen and they protected it and they protected their vision for it with all their might. No one wanted to make a show about food until the bear showed up, like no one wanted to do that. Do you know what I mean? So like everything is an outlier. Everything good is an outlier. And I think you have to remember that. And that said, like I think a lot of us and our community is pushed very often into these sort of like technical scientific businessy areas, which is very lucky because we end up having a lot of people in like the leadership space and like influential, like as we become more and more um influential, which seems to be happening. I hope that we can keep in mind that there's nothing more important than like emotional intelligence. I think that we can be a very achievement-oriented society, which is great in some ways because it allows you to open doors that wouldn't open otherwise. But I think that like your own interests and your own values have to be the foundation of what comes next. It's not about attention, it's not about power, it's not about anything, it's not about money, it's not about anything other than who you are as a person. Yeah, I think that a lot of our ambition, which we all have, I think it's a trait, to pull yourself out of the rubble. That's how we were built, and it's how we build our children. can turn very quickly into careerism and opportunism. And I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that we can stay true to who we are. And
Well,
also to think there's also another thing that we sometimes do, not us necessarily. I think it's more about our parents, but the way they like can constantly sort of see themselves as victims, which they absolutely have been. But don't let that get in the way of your empathy for truly every other person in the world who is also experiencing their own series of heartbreaks and tragedies, you know?
yeah. Well, that is like a perfect way to wrap up the episode. I do just want to do like a final thing, which is I want to give you a
Yeah.
chance to promote any future projects you
Mm.
have coming, whether it's like film, screen on the screen or on
Hmm.
paper, or any events that you have upcoming, if any of our listeners
Yeah.
are interested in kind of getting to know you that way. But yeah, if you have anything and anything at all to promote, go ahead.
Yes, I have some events coming up because I have just kind of rolling book events where I do like a reading and a Q&A, or I have also like a sup, like there's a million different things. So next week on the 20th, I'm doing an event in San Diego. That's like a supper club with a friend of mine who is a who runs a supper club there, and so it'll be like Indian snacks and a chat about the book. That should be really, really fun. All this stuff is usually on my Instagram. So pop on Instagram, it's Prima too. And then I'll do another event in LA, which will be a craft night. That'll be really fun in like early September. I'm putting together a variety show here in September as well. I'll be in New Orleans. I'll be at the Mississippi Book Festival in early September. I will be at the Miami Book Festival, and I will just keep updating with events as they come along. But usually the best place, honestly, to find me, RIP Twitter, very sad, but usually I post to Instagram pretty often.
Okay, well, then that's it. If you guys are interested in following along to Priyanka's journey and to see any upcoming events near you, and also watching that space for future projects and books and film that she might release, then we will have her Instagram linked if you are listening to us, in the description of the episode. And if you are finding us through Instagram, it'll be in our Instagram caption. But thank you so much for joining us today, Priyanka, and to our listeners. We got a chance to discuss her memoir, Bird Milk and Mosquito Bones, and we got a chance to delve into familial relationships, how our culture has shaped us, and take in a little bit of advice for somebody who has had a career in so many different similar fields, but in a variety of roles. You can listen to our previous and future episodes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us and hit the bell to get notified when future episodes release. And you can follow us on Instagram at KOA Youth to see all the previous episodes and to see announcements of future episodes. Thank you, and we will see you next time on Everything Koshur.